There is a root cellar dug into a hillside behind a farmhouse in central Iowa, lined with fieldstone a great-grandfather stacked by hand in 1911, that stayed stocked with a full year of food, almost without interruption for nearly 7 decades. And if a single room could be said to hold the proof of a family's entire way of surviving, this is the one. It held rows of canning jars, hundreds of them, put up every August and September in a kitchen that ran hot for weeks straight. Tomatoes, green beans, peaches, applesauce, meat packed down in its own fat. Each jar dated in pencil on the lid, each one a small, deliberate insurance policy against a winter nobody could fully predict. It held bins of potatoes and onions and squash, layered in straw, checked weekly all winter for the first soft spot of rot, because a single overlooked potato could spread and take half a bin with it before anyone noticed. It held cured hams hanging from the rafters, salted and smoked months earlier by hands that knew exactly how much salt and exactly how many days of smoke a piece of meat needed to last until spring without a refrigerator anywhere in the house. It held the specific, practiced calculations of a family that had done the arithmetic of survival every single year without ever writing the numbers down. How many jars of beans a family of 7 actually ate between October and May? How many hogs needed butchering each fall? How much wood needed splitting and stacked and covered before the first hard frost? Because getting any of those numbers wrong by even a little meant a genuinely hard spring, not a hypothetical one. That cellar is still there. The shelves are mostly empty now, holding a few jars of jam made more as a hobby than a necessity, because the family that farms that land today drives to a grocery store 15 minutes away, same as everyone else, and nobody spends September standing over a boiling water bath canner from 6 in the morning until well past dark. That's what this video is about. Part 1. Self-sufficiency wasn't a philosophy. It was the only option for most of American farm history. Growing and preserving your own food, making and mending your own clothes, and building and repairing your own tools weren't lifestyle choices anyone deliberated over. They were simply what survival required in places where the nearest store might be an hour's wagon ride away, and where a family that ran short of food in February had no fast, reliable way to get more before spring. This is easy to romanticize from a distance and worth being honest about up close. Self-sufficiency, in practice, meant an enormous, unrelenting amount of physical labor, performed by every able body in the household, with real and sometimes fatal consequences when something went wrong. A crop failure, an early frost, a sickness that struck during the 1-week hay needed cutting. The skills a farm family developed weren't a rejection of convenience. They were the only available response to a world that offered none. What made this way of living genuinely remarkable wasn't the individual skills themselves, many of which were common knowledge at the time. It was the sheer breadth of them held inside a single household. One family typically capable of feeding itself, clothing itself, housing itself, doctoring itself in a pinch, and repairing nearly everything it owned, without needing to pay a single other person for any of it across an ordinary year. That breadth, more than any one skill, is the thing that's actually disappeared. Part 2. The calendar nobody wrote down, but everyone knew by heart. A self-sufficient farm ran on a calendar that existed almost entirely in memory and habit rather than on paper, and learning that calendar, knowing without being told that this was the week to start the garden, or the week the hogs needed to go to slaughter before the weather turned unpredictable, was itself a form of literacy that took a full childhood to acquire. Children on these farms absorb the calendar the way children absorb a language, through constant immersion rather than formal lessons. A 10-year-old could often tell you, without needing to check anything, when it was time to start seedlings indoors, when the last frost date usually fell in that particular valley, when the hay needed to come in before a storm that hadn't happened yet, but that the sky and the wind made obvious to anyone who'd spent enough years reading both. This knowledge was hyperlocal in a way that no almanac could fully capture. Specific to that exact hillside, that exact soil, that exact family's particular fields, passed down because it had been tested, wrong guess by wrong guess, across multiple generations who'd farmed that same ground. Missing the calendar had real consequences that a modern household simply doesn't face in the same way. Planting a week late could mean a smaller harvest heading into winter. Butchering too early or too late could mean meat that spoiled before it was needed, or an animal that had eaten through feed the family couldn't spare. The calendar wasn't decoration. It was the actual operating system of the household, and every family member, down to the youngest child capable of carrying a bucket, was expected to know their place inside it. Part 3. Preserving a year's worth of food with no way to keep it cold. Long before household refrigeration, keeping a family fed through a full winter required an entire, overlapping set of preservation skills, each suited to a different kind of food, each demanding its own exact knowledge of timing, temperature, and technique that a mistake could ruin in a single afternoon. Canning required understanding acidity and processing time well enough to prevent botulism in an era before that word was in common use, a skill usually passed from mother to daughter over years of standing side by side at the same stove, learning by direct correction rather than a printed recipe. Salt curing and smoking meat required its own separate expertise, different again from root cellaring, which required its own understanding of which vegetables kept best in sand, which in straw, which needed to be pickled instead because they wouldn't keep any other way at all. Drying fruit, rendering and storing lard, making sausage that would last, fermenting cabbage into something that would hold through a whole winter. Each of these was a distinct craft, learned hands-on, refined through direct and sometimes costly failure. A family capable of running all of these preservation methods at once, every single autumn, without any of them online or reliant on hired help, was running what amounted to a small, highly specialized food processing operation entirely inside one household, timed to compress an entire year's food security into about 6 intense weeks of late summer and early fall. Part 4. The tools that had to be made, mended, and known inside out. A self-sufficient farm couldn't call anyone when a plow broke in the middle of planting or a barn door came off its hinges during a storm. Whoever was on the farm that day had to know how to fix it, using whatever was on hand, because waiting for outside help could cost a season. This produced a specific, practical kind of mechanical and material literacy that most people today have no working equivalent of. Sharpening and rehandling tools, patching harness leather, splinting a fence, forging or repairing simple metal parts at a home forge, keeping a hand-cranked or horse-drawn piece of equipment functioning with no factory-trained technician anywhere nearby. These were baseline expectations, not specialized trades reserved for a few people in the community. A farmer who couldn't keep his own equipment running through a season was, in a very real sense, not going to make it through that season at all. Clothing followed the same logic. Spinning, weaving, and sewing weren't hobbies but necessities, with worn clothes mended and remended, patched over patches, until a garment had been rebuilt so many times over the years that almost none of the original fabric remained. Shoes were resoled at home for as long as resoling was possible. Nothing was replaced simply because replacing it was easier than fixing it, because for most of this era, replacing it usually wasn't easier at all. Part 5. What replaced the self-sufficient farm and what the replacement cost. Rural electrification, refrigeration, reliable roads, and a cash economy that made buying goods faster and often cheaper than making them all arrived over the following decades. And each one, taken on its own terms, represented a genuine and welcome reduction in the sheer physical brutality that self-sufficiency actually required. Nobody who spent a real childhood hauling water, splitting wood before dawn, or standing over a canner in 90-degree August heat is lobbying seriously to bring that specific burden back. But something specific disappeared along with the necessity, and it's worth naming honestly. A breadth of practical competence, the ability of one household to feed, clothe, house, and repair itself almost entirely from its own labor and its own land narrowed, generation by generation, into a set of specialized skills now held by very few people at all, most of them professionals paid to do just one piece of what a single farm family used to do all of it themselves. The specific, hands-on relationship with exactly where food and clothing and shelter actually come from has faded too, replaced by a supply chain most people can't meaningfully trace past the shelf where they bought something. And the deep, load-bearing confidence that used to come from knowing a household could weather real disruption on its own resources, a bad harvest year, a hard winter, a genuine emergency has been replaced for most families by a reasonable trust in systems and stores that, for all their real convenience. Part 6. What's still worth keeping from that farmhouse? You do not need a working farm or a genuine life-or-death dependence on your own labor to recover a small, real piece of what that self-sufficiency actually provided. Learn one full preservation skill from start to finish, on purpose, rather than only ever buying the finished product. Canning a single batch of tomatoes or curing one batch of bacon recreates a small piece of the direct, hands-on relationship with food that used to be automatic and is now something most people have to choose deliberately to experience even once. Keep one basic repair skill sharp instead of defaulting to replacement every time. Learning to actually mend a torn seam, sharpen a dull blade, or fix a simple broken tool recreates a small piece of the confidence that used to come standard with running a household, the quiet reassurance of not being entirely dependent on someone else for every small failure. Teach a child the calendar of something real, even something small. A backyard garden planted and tended on a real, known schedule. When to start seeds, when to expect the last frost, when to harvest before things go to waste. Does a small piece of what a working farm calendar used to do for every child raised inside one. It builds a genuine, felt understanding of where food actually comes from and what it actually takes to make it appear. Part 7. The medicine cabinet that was also a garden and a memory. A farm family living an hour or more from the nearest doctor couldn't afford to treat every fever, cut, or difficult birth as an emergency requiring outside help, which meant a real, working knowledge of home medicine was as essential to the household as any skill involved in growing food, and just as carefully passed down. This knowledge lived in two places at once. It lived in a specific patch of garden set aside for medicinal herbs, comfrey for bruises and sprains, yarrow to slow bleeding, chamomile and mint for a settled stomach, each planted and tended with the same seriousness given to the vegetable rows because a family genuinely relied on what grew there. And it lived, just as importantly, in the memory of whichever woman in the household, usually a mother or grandmother, had learned from her own mother before her how much of which tincture a child's fever actually called for, how to set a simple fracture well enough to hold until it healed, how to recognize the difference between an illness that would pass on its own and one that meant hitching up the wagon no matter the hour or the weather. This was serious, high-stakes knowledge, held by people with no formal medical training at all, and it carried real risk alongside its real necessity. Misjudged doses, infections that a hospital could have prevented, complications during childbirth that a trained doctor might have caught in time. Nobody romanticized this the way it's sometimes romanticized now. Families who had access to a real doctor used one, gladly, whenever they could. But for the long stretches when they couldn't, this remembered, homegrown medical knowledge was the entire difference between a household that could handle its own emergencies and one that couldn't, and it was treated, accordingly, with the same weight and seriousness as any other survival skill on the farm. Part 8. Raising children who were already part of the workforce. Childhood on a self-sufficient farm looked almost nothing like childhood as it's understood today, not because these families loved their children any less, but because a household running on its own labor genuinely needed every set of hands it had, starting far earlier than would seem reasonable now. A child of 5 or 6 was already gathering eggs and carrying kindling. By 8 or 9, most children on a working farm had a real, assigned set of chores that the household actually depended on, not busy work invented to build character, but genuine labor whose absence would have been noticed and felt. By their early teens, many farm children could run a significant portion of the household's operations alone for a day or more if a parent was sick or away, because they'd been doing pieces of that work, under supervision, for years already. This produced a specific kind of confidence and competence that came directly from being trusted with real consequences at a young age, alongside a genuine loss of the extended protected childhood that later generations would come to expect as a baseline. Both things were true at once. A 10-year-old who could milk a cow unsupervised, keep a fire going through the night, or care for younger siblings for a full day while parents worked a distant field had a kind of capability that's rare in a 10-year-old today, and also carried a kind of adult weight, that early, that most people today would be uncomfortable placing on a child of that age. The self-sufficient farm needed both things to be true simultaneously, and mostly didn't have the luxury of choosing otherwise. Part 9. The neighbors who made total self-sufficiency possible in the first place. For all the real individual competence a single farm family developed, almost none of them were actually as isolated as the phrase self-sufficient suggests, and it's worth being honest about the piece that word tends to erase. A barn raising, a threshing crew that moved from farm to farm at harvest, a birth attended by a neighboring woman experienced in midwifery, a family taking in another family's children for a season after a death or a bad injury. None of this was self-sufficiency in the strict individual sense. It was a tightly interdependent network of households, each one capable of running independently for ordinary days, and each one also fully expected to show up for the others during the days that weren't ordinary at all. This distinction matters because the version of self-sufficiency that actually worked wasn't a household standing entirely alone. It was a household competent enough to carry its own weight most of the time, embedded inside a community that could be counted on, without question, the moment that weight became too much for one family to carry by itself. A barn that burned down was rebuilt in a single day by a dozen neighboring families arriving, unasked, with tools and lumber and food for the crew. A widow left to run a farm alone found her fields planted and her harvest brought in by neighbors who simply showed up, because everyone understood, without needing it explained, that the same thing could happen to any of them next. What's easy to miss, looking back, is that this network of mutual obligation was itself a skill, a set of habits around noticing when a neighbor needed help before being asked, and around showing up reliably enough, year after year, that the help would be there in return when it was your own family's turn to need it. That skill, arguably, was the thing that made all the other skills survivable. The farmhouse outside that Iowa hillside is still standing, and the family that lives there today still keeps a garden and still puts up a few jars of tomatoes most Augusts, though nobody depends on that root cellar to make it through a winter anymore. They do it, mostly, because something in them still wants to know they could. But everyone who grew up on farms like that one still remembers standing in a hot kitchen in late summer, hands stained from tomatoes, watching a mother or grandmother check a jar's seal by ear, listening for the small, satisfying pop that meant one more piece of the coming winter had just been accounted for. If your family farmed, or still farms, or if someone in your family passed down even one of these old, practical skills to you directly, tell us about it in the comments. These skills held more of a family's actual survival than almost anything else they owned, and every story shared here helps keep a little more of it alive. And if this is the kind of history worth remembering, hit subscribe. We dig one of these up every week, the quiet, practical kind of history that used to live in a family's own two hands and changed everything anyway.